Welcome to Bottom Up, a monthly podcast dedicated to issues and topics of interest to young lawyers in Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Emil Ovbiagele.
And I'm Kristen Hardy, and we're your hosts. This is the Bottom Up Podcast. Hello, welcome to all of our viewers, listeners. Long time no speak.
Happy podcast day.
Happy podcast day. How are you, Emil?
I'm okay.
What's new?
I'm okay.
What does that mean?
It's been quite the summer. It's been I don't know, I felt like I kind of had one of those nut summers. It just kind of happened. Summer was a day and then fall came. And yeah, it's not like the work gets less in the fall. I think summer makes the work more bearable. I don't know. So it's like the weather changes, the work's the same,
the weather has not changed yet. It's officially fall, and it's still hot.
No, it's 65 today.
But it's hot. I mean, maybe this room is hot. It's no air at OV being consulting.
Hey, times are hard. Inflation's up, you know. Exactly.
I've had a pretty good summer. It's been really, really busy, though. And the work is not, I don't know, you can't call it. You don't know when it's busy or when it isn't busy. But I can see your face. You want to make a comment. Don't even say it.
No. Hey, out in the burbs, it's always great.
I knew it was coming.
It's always great, you know. In Main Street law, you know, it's not always.
Well, speaking of, we have one of my fellow Marquette Law. Actually, you're a double Marquette guy. Marquette Law, Marquette undergrad. But we all went to law school together, even though you're a tad younger than us. So I want to welcome to the podcast, Hiriam Bradley. Hi, Hiram.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good. I actually think that I'm older than Emil. He's super.
That's actually true.
Hey,
you're right. You're right.
Yeah,
I forget.
He went to school a bit earlier.
My age is not an issue here. Yeah, technically, Hiram and I were in the same undergraduate class. We graduated a year earlier.
Okay, you guys go back. So Hiram is an attorney at a financial services company that I know very well, and he works in privacy and tech contracts. I usually reach out to him if I have a question about an agreement. He's really good at drafting and negotiations, and then also this emerging field of artificial intelligence. So we brought on Hiram today to talk to us about AI and privacy. But before we get there, tell us a little bit about yourself. Really tell the listeners, because again, we know you pretty well.
Born and raised in Chicago, Illinois. Attended Marquette University for undergrad, stayed for law school. Always knew that I wanted to, work in some form of regulatory field or sector, intersectionality with the law.
Wait. When you say always knew, like, when?
Well, you didn't
know that freshman.
Since undergrad, actually. So since about 18 or 19 or so.
So you were holding back in those house parties?
I ran track at Marquette University. So my first exposure to the law was through our compliance department. The director of compliance was an attorney. So I got to pick her brain quite often and kind of figured out my career path from there and just let it evolve over time.
That's interesting. As a fellow Big East short sprinter, also our head of compliance at the time when I was in undergrad, she was a law school grad as well. I never thought about going into compliance necessarily, but interesting, they all have kind of that law background. Mm-hmm. So Chicago native, and you still find yourself working at a Milwaukee-based company. What keeps you in Milwaukee?
Well, Milwaukee's my second home. I love it here. I think it's a great environment, a great city, an emerging city, much like the area of law that I do, very emerging. I'm excited to see kind of how Milwaukee continues to grow and develop. It has a bit of everything, and we talk about this all the time. It's a great place to be.
It has everything. So you agree that it's a great food scene. Is that?
It's an emerging food scene for sure.
Emerging.
Wait, when does a place like emerge?
The buzz, the magazines, you start getting a little bit of TikTok traction.
Wow,
I think I take issue with that. I think Milwaukee has now emerged. I've been hearing the whole emerging line for like 16 years.
Mm-hmm.
Let's give it its due.
We can do that. We can do that today.
I'll let y'all have it. That's what I'm hearing. Okay, so talk to me about graduated from Marquette. What was your first job, and how did you get into that role?
No, absolutely. So I began my career as a regulatory attorney in banking. I worked at a trade association located in Madison, Wisconsin. Essentially, I worked with GLBA and various privacy laws, and we provided legal information to about 98% of the banks located here in Wisconsin. So I got the opportunity to work with a ton of community banks and help them get their various legal and compliance programs off of the ground to a certain extent, or to just give guidance whenever they may need it.
So you never worked at a firm?
No, I did not. I began my career as counsel at a trade association. So got pretty lucky there. After graduating law school, the individual who held the job prior to me had just been or recently been appointed, I believe, as chief legal officer of the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions. Position opened up, and they decided to go with some youth.
So I like how you said you got very lucky because you avoided practicing law in a private setting. I don't. Yeah, it is. I tell Kristen, I'm like, I feel like private practice of law and regular practice of law is like being in the ghetto, and you're like, hey, I got lucky. I went in house day one, and I've been in house all third.
Yeah,
honestly,
I've heard their different experiences.
They are for sure, but it's you say luck, and we know it's not just luck, right?
Absolutely.
It's really, as a person who did the same thing, it's like opportunity, being at the right place, right time, making that right connection. Mm-hmm. So how did you find this role, Hiram? Did you just apply? I actually don't know the answer to this, really.
Yeah, no, I applied. My position was, and my philosophy has always been, the more you put yourself out there, the better things can be for you. Mm-hmm. So it's a numbers game. So if you apply to 100 places versus applying to 5 places, you're likely to get more interviews where you can go there and showcase, your skills, your talents, and your capacity to learn and grow as a young attorney at that point. Absolutely. Not barely an attorney at that point.
Right. So, that's cool. So then where'd you go next? What was your next role?
Right. So I then moved to a fairly large bank servicing firm based in Chicago. Around that time, we'd had heard whispers of a European law that may have some American effect or applicability. So I got the opportunity to really dive into the GDPR, which is the European privacy protection law. And from there, I then pivoted to fintech company in downtown Chicago, where I got the opportunity to work with CCPA, which is now the CPRA to a certain extent, just various products at the emerging technology front. So
as third-year law school student or a brand new lawyer, how do I make sense of what privacy law entails? What body of law? What does it take to become a privacy attorney? What are you doing on a day-to-day basis?
So if I had to give the fifth graders summary as to what I do, I'd probably say that I ensure that my company uses data in a manner that it tells you that it's going to use that data. So whether that's via the privacy policy or other forms of communication in which we've communicated how we will use your data, I ensure that that's done for the sake of transparency, honesty, and an overall great customer experience.
This is the other thing I thought Emil was going to say. It's a lot of acronyms in privacy, to the extent you remember what those acronyms are, because I know you use them and you don't have to say the real thing all the time. To the extent you remember, try to say the actual full language so people know what you're talking about.
No, of course.
So go from the fintech company. I'm interested in how because you're kind of our SME in the HIPAA space and the privacy space. If we have a question, we're like, go to Hiram. He has the answer for various entities. So how did you become a SME in this area?
Really relying on the network. I can say this wholeheartedly. The privacy community is great. You get on LinkedIn and you reach out to anyone who has CIPT, which is the Certified Information Privacy Technologist certification. The other is the PP, is the Privacy Professional designation on their names. Everyone's willing to kind of help, allow you to pick their brains, very high level. There's a ton of resources out there. So I'd say just diligence and over time is how you become a subject matter expert in any field, honestly. So just putting in the time and effort, and over time it begins to feel like you're riding a bike a bit.
And that was at the fintech company where they kind of, you delved into it. Mm-hmm. Privacy is still new to me. So was it, no one was doing it and they were like, hey, throw the young attorney there? Did you kind of raise your hand? How did you lean into it?
Yeah, I think it was a combination of things. First, it was the emerging aspect of privacy. Privacy's been around for a while, but it hasn't really reached the prominence that it very much deserves until very recently. I think the fair information practices go back to the 1970s, maybe, if I'm correct. But with the emergence of state privacy laws such as the CCPA, the California privacy law. It was more so developing a deep bench at the fintech level as we were working very fast and cutting edge technologies from a product perspective. We wanted to make sure that ducks were in a row. So it was, let's get as many attorneys as possible up to speed with what's happening on the privacy front. So it was a combination of me raising my hand, but also a genuine need.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
State Bar of Wisconsin members can apply for accident insurance, which provides quick access to money for covered injury-related expenses. Coverage is issued by the Prudential Insurance Company of America. To learn more, visit wisbar.memberenroll.com.
Networking can be an important part of your practice, and there's no better place to network than the Wisconsin Solo and Small Firm Conference. Find out more at wisbar.org/WSSFC. Thank you, and now back to the Bottom Up Podcast.
At its core, privacy law to me always has had this consumer protectionist idea around it, right? The whole idea that sensitive personal information given to corporations or even the government or whatever should be treated in a certain way. About a decade ago, we had the slew of, those privacy breaches. And then, we start realizing what companies are collecting on us and what they aren't collecting and what they should. And then the new slew of regulations. So to Kristen's point, right, this is something I feel like we've sort of, one of those practice areas that we've sort of emerged with from graduation. I mean, even 10 years ago, some of the concerns you had you had in your industry weren't even present. And so, how did you know that this was something that was going to catch fire and something you wanted to stick with?
Well, I think that you highlighted it very perfectly and diligently. The fact that a few large data breaches did occur, and it became very public knowledge what information companies may have about individuals. So I think that assisted in thrusting it to the forefront of the public opinion. And I really didn't have an indication that I would stick with it. It was more so, and I always say this about privacy, I feel like privacy is the puppy practice area in the sense of it's like a cute dog wanting to follow every single practice area and be involved. And if you pay enough attention to it, it kind of sticks around. So that's how I got into privacy and how I stay into privacy.
What do you think some of, or maybe one of your most significant professional challenges in this area has been, and how did you overcome that?
I wouldn't say I've overcome it quite yet, but I will say that the most challenging aspect has been the fact that the laws are still developing. So on one end, you have a number of laws that arguably apply to new technologies, particularly in spaces like employment that require interpretation. And on the other end, you have a bunch of emerging, newer, upcoming laws that also require interpretation. So I think that the challenge for most legal professionals in the field is, one, getting a grasp of which of those laws and regulations apply to your particular practice area, and also providing counsel in a way that allows your business to operate in a responsible but innovative fashion.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think you just touched on something that we had discussed briefly before you came on, and how broad this area is. Because it impacts everything, right? It's down to even the ethical standards required from lawyers now in terms of protection of client information. For personal injury attorneys, there are now privacy law considerations, and for any law firm in general. And so how do lawyers get a sense of what privacy laws or concerns apply to their practice areas?
So there's a ton of resources. If you visit NIST, for example, NIST, it's going to give you a bunch of security and technology standards. It's going to outline where they could potentially apply other guidelines for the most part. Again, just getting on LinkedIn and seeing what's out there from a resource perspective. If you're working in the financial services industry, you're going to want to look at, GLBA, which is the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which kind of governs what financial institutions can do with NPI, which is non-public information, personal information. So there's a ton of regulations out there. But if you've been practicing in a particular area, I think you have a general understanding of what's out there. So I know that I mentioned employment earlier. They focus on ECOA, for example. There's a ton of employment-based laws that are currently already enacted that people have arguably stated apply to emerging technologies and AI. So a part of it is your personal subject matter expertise in your particular area, and you'll see how those laws may be applied to new technologies as well.
We're talking a lot about privacy or data privacy, but I know you're also doing a lot of work. Well, we haven't really talked about your work with tech transactions, but then also artificial intelligence. So how'd you get into these other areas? I know AI is still emerging, but how'd you get into that?
This goes back to kind of the puppy analogy that I use with privacy. It wants to be involved in every other practice area. The intersectionality between artificial intelligence and privacy is very, very well documented and outlined. They go hand in hand because as you're implementing systems on the AI side, whether that's the LLMs, the large language models, or general AI, the underlying algorithms have to be fed data. So ingesting a ton of data, and now the question becomes, well, where did you get this data? Whose data is it? Who does it belong to? Is it PII, personally identifiable data? Is it de-identified data, anonymized data? So you begin to really dive into those questions and then see the intersectionality between some of the protections and obligations that you have to protect various forms of data and information.
No, you got me nerding out a little bit, and let's kind of take this conversation a little bit, just a step further. You struck on a lot of things in terms of the conversations, the privacy conversations surrounding AI, and I think privacy law in general, in terms of big data, who gets what information, who gets to use it, who gets to decide how it's used. So for the first time, we have an emerging technology where at least those questions are being asked at the same time. Because if you think about social media, for example, a lot of the privacy law concerns came after the fact, after it became a thing. So we have a situation where we have this technology emerging, these questions are being asked. And it sounds like half of this, or at least a good portion of this kind of discussion isn't just merely, in terms of practicalities, but also in terms of philosophy. What type of philosophies do we want to base these systems of regulations on? Is it going to be a pro-consumer or pro-business style ideology? And how's that conversation going, and where do you fall on that spectrum?
That's a great question, and it's such an interesting question in a lot of ways, because I think the writing is on the wall in a lot of ways in regards to how America has decided to regulate and view consumer rights as it relates to their data. And it's kind of in stark comparison to Europe, where I'll say this on the record, I'm a big fan of what Europe's doing, not only with the AI Act, but what we've seen with GDPR and its applicability to AI as well, where there it's seen almost as a fundamental right. So you have the ability to opt in, whereas in America, you opt out. And that can be tricky in a lot of ways for individuals. And I think of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's standard of the least sophisticated consumer, right? When I think about the least sophisticated consumer, I envision a world in which, they don't have to read through, pages and pages of legally and privacy policies. I very much would love to see more of an opt-in type of mechanism in the States.
So you're saying, this is very important. I didn't know this. So you're saying, basically under the European model, the idea is we start with a presumption that your data is yours.
Correct.
Right. Yep. So you have to opt in, and the North American, or at least the American model, is we start with the presumption that your data is ours, and you have to opt out. That sounds like a fundamental, philosophical difference amongst regions in terms of how, these issues will be addressed. Now, what are the complications that will arise from that in a world that's more connected and more global, where these different systems have to interact?
Yeah, that's where it gets very complex, because in the European Union specifically, there are rules through the forms of data transfers in which if a particular country doesn't have particular privacy standards or guarantees contractually, you can't share data coming from the European Union to other places. So it gets complex in that regard for sure. But you can always contract into a reasonable place in which you can begin to kind of share data across the pond as well. It does, yeah, it does add for some complexities for sure.
That's so cool.
I fully agree with the Europeans' approach of it being a fundamental right, the right to privacy.
I think I'm quitting my area of law. This sounds,
data is so valuable, so how do we get due consideration for that?
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Who better to trust when you're facing a malpractice claim in Wilmec? With your Wisconsin licensed claims attorneys and strong network of defense counsel, find peace of mind with Wilmec, supporting and partnering with Wisconsin law firms since 1986.
Hi, Russell Nicolay here with Nicolay Law, Accident and Injury Lawyers. If you have clients that have been injured, my office would love the opportunity to help them get compensated and get their life back on track. We handle referrals and co-counsel relationships on injury cases all across Wisconsin.
Thank you. And now back to the Bottom Up podcast.
And I'm really thinking about this in terms of, every social media site, Google, everything has this AI function now where they're obviously taking our data. I mean, apparently, maybe they've probably always been taking our data and we aren't paying that any attention, but it's really obvious to us. So we're always giving away private information all the time, especially using the internet. So how do you communicate the importance of privacy in terms of consumer protection?
It's almost a Chicken Little approach where you tell people the sky's falling and go from there. So in the privacy world, I think there's two prominent schools of thoughts, and that's what Emil and I were just speaking about as to whether privacy is a fundamental right or not. And depending on where you fall is how you take that approach. I do believe that privacy is a fundamental right, so I do take that approach of tell as many people as possible. So to your point, actually, I think within the last week or so, I caught wind of this. LinkedIn, for example, has begun to use your data to train their models. And you have to go and opt out and follow a series of instructions to get that done. So again, it's more so about being diligent, aware, but also spreading that awareness as much as you possibly can so that individuals can make that ultimate determination.
But who's making sure that this actually happens? That's been one of my biggest concerns because it is it's a very self-regulated industry. Mm-hmm. I mean, absent some whistleblower and a big class action, it's not like we have regulatory agencies that ensure that companies are complying with even their own at least in the social media space. That example you just gave, the opt-in, opt-out. And is there anything the government can do to bridge that gap?
Yes, there are a ton of things that the government could do, but I think that it takes us back into that philosophical conversation in regards to, as America, how do we view freedom? The freedom to contract, for example, the ability to determine whether or not a good or a service is for you, and it becomes a bit murky in regards to some people would like that protection, other people would like to make that determination themselves. So it comes down to the American philosophy. And
have you found that there has been enough privacy literacy amongst the American populace for them to even be able to make an educated decision one way or another? From your experience?
No, yeah, I think it's getting better, but I honestly, I don't think so. For example, I know when AI first began to emerge for general use or general public use, everyone was creating the professional photos or here's me if I lived on Mars type of photos.
Giving them your face for free.
Until you read the terms and conditions. And,
right.
I was new. The Nigerian in me was like, wait, everyone doing the whole mosaic photographs.
Did not participate in that.
What is the catch?
Yeah. So I think we are doing better at, getting the education out there. There's a bunch of consumer protection lobby groups. There are enforcement agencies being stood up on the state level, California being one of the most prominent states. So it's just a matter of time until we figure out what's going to happen. Obviously, we're waiting to see if we're ever going to get a federal privacy law, and that's really going to clear the air a bit in regards to where we've decided to go as a society.
So you've been in banking, financial services, pretty much your entire career. And that is a heavily regulated area. You know, Emil was talking about from the social media perspective, you know, who's regulating? Is it self-regulating? It's not self-regulating for financial services. There is someone who's making sure you do what you're supposed to do. So how do those, beyond that point, how do the privacy concerns differ from financial services compared to some other industries that you may have your finger on the pulse of?
Yeah, I think it's the sensitivity of the data, the nature of the data that makes it, in my opinion, code red when it comes to protecting and regulating. Because if you think about other industries, yeah, we may get some confidential information or some proprietary information, but when you're dealing with individual consumers, you're dealing with lives. So a data breach can mean identity theft or fraud. It could mean financial ruin in some instances. So I think that there is a heightened scrutiny on financial services and the data that they have.
And I really like that distinction, idea being that there are certain industries where we have those tools of enforcement, right? So in one way, that shows us that it can be done, right?
Absolutely.
But number two, isn't one of the issues you're going to run into, how do you define some of these new type of companies? For example, how do you I would argue that Amazon or Google probably has more information than anybody in any financial sector of a financial company. How do you define those companies such that you could even create a set of laws that applies to them neatly? Because I think that's the real concern that we're facing. It's not necessarily that my mom and shop bank down the road or my insurance company, you know, which is well regulated, might have lax or misuse my data. It's that these countries, these new, not countries, these new companies, which could be countries, we don't even know how to define them, such that we don't know what rules apply to them.
I do think that the law does a pretty good job at having broad definitions. I don't have any of the definitions in front of me, for example, but I know under New York, a financial institution or a covered entity may be defined broadly enough so that various corporations and companies do fall within the definition of whether that be a covered entity, financial institution. So I think that there are mechanisms, you know, even if a company says, hey, we're a tech company that specializes here. But when you look at the underlying data that they may get or the services that they may present out to the world, I think that a lot of the agencies have kind of been privy to that and have begun to expand their definitions through various amendments and new laws as well.
Define the covered entity based on the data based on the data being collected. So you could have a shoe shine company. If you're collecting socials, you have to abide by these rules.
Right. What are you doing with this data? You know, that's always going to be important. What are you doing with this data? Why do you need it? So if you have it, you may arguably really cool. be covered for sure. So
yeah, that's a good point, Emil, and a good answer, Hiram, just because the little bit that I've had to look into it when HIPAA, for example, intersects with my work, and you realize like, okay, these are defined terms already. And it doesn't say insurance company, or it doesn't necessarily say, sometimes it does, but other times it says a company that does XYZ, and it fits. It's broad enough, which that's how we kind of want it to be construed.
And especially in the HIPAA context, which you're very aware of as well. You know, there are carve-outs where you may be a covered entity in some aspects, in other aspects you may not be. So
Okay. Isn't that part of the problem? I don't see all these exceptions or whatever. If you're taking certain types of information, shouldn't it just be universal rules? So why are our regulations so complicated so as to get so many lawyers working, interpreting the exceptions to the exceptions? It could just be easy.
Yeah. When is anything in the law easy? Like, especially in a highly regulated industry.
So I'll tell you this. There was one guy who ran for president once upon a time. Never really liked anything he said. But there was one thing he always used to say. It's like, when I become president, I want everyone to fill your taxes on the back of a post. I'm like, you know what? Why can't we fill our taxes? Why does the government ever be like, hey, you know what? We know what you owe. But how about you guess?
Right.
And tell us what you think you owe.
Or hire someone and pay them a lot of money to figure that out.
Well, I think at least I can speak on the HIPAA front on that side. I think that there is a carve out because of what you can do with particular types of data. So the purpose of HIPAA is to regulate that protected health information. So if you're a company that's large enough where you may have other types of data or offer other services, some of those rules that apply to protecting an individual's very sensitive medical data may not apply to some of the financial stuff. So they carve it out in that regard.
So what are some trends that you're currently seeing in the AI technology space that could affect some privacy regulations?
Two trends that are on my mind at the moment is probably the increased use in decision-making and AI surveillance. So to go back to the first point, it's when you're deploying AI systems to make decisions, whether that's for employment purposes. I submit my resume, the AI looks at it, sees whether or not I'd be a good fit for this company. It makes a decision, and the hiring manager then makes a decision based on the AI's decision. That's very, very much impacting privacy regulations at the moment to make sure that there are various disclosures. In California through the CPRA, there is a prohibition on profiling without adequate notice and the ability to opt out. Automated decision-making is also being regulated under the CPRA in California. At the moment, it's very broad, and they've allowed the agency to go back to the drawing board and figure out how do we need to expand these particular regulations so that it encompasses automated decision-making appropriately.
And now, a word from our sponsors. Would you like to implement new efficiencies into your law practice but don't know where to begin? Practice 411, the State Bar of Wisconsin's Law Office Management Assistance Program, is the place to start. Don't wait. Contact Practice 411 today for a complimentary and confidential consultation at 1-800-957-4670. Thank you. And now back to the Bottom Up Podcast.
Where's the line, though, between regulation and overregulation? Because, I mean, in very important regards, I think, California, in terms of the regulatory scheme, just suffers from the fact that it happens to be just the only, it's got this European mindset, within a different region. And then you oftentimes hear that, companies that have to operate within those laws or whatever, it does add an added administrative cost, which all does increase the price and does affect the consumer. And some small businesses or mid-sized businesses may not be able to cope with it. So what's that sweet spot?
That's a very good question. If I were able to find a sweet spot, I think I'd be retired by now. But I do think that regulations like this, CCPA, CPRA, try to carve out thresholds in regards to how much data that you may process, how much money you bring in as an organization. So they do have some weeding out processes to determine who's in scope of those particular regulations. But it's difficult for sure. And I think it goes back to the philosophical question of, well, what's more important to you? Is it innovation or is it consumer protection? I'm on the side that consumer protection should always be at the forefront. So maybe I'm okay with being overregulated if it means, hey, we've taken the time to.
Very un-American of you. Very, very un-American.
Really?
I'd like to take the time to understand, what's happening. AI in itself is moving so fast, and and every day it's getting more and more robust and intelligent. I know that, for example, ChatGPT is working on their next iteration, ChatGPT Strawberry, which is going to take some time to ingest the information before giving you an answer. More inferences would be made through their new technology.
Why do they name you Strawberry?
That's the code name. Sorry, it's like AI. Strawberry. So,
are you telling us secrets that we're not supposed to know?
It's public knowledge. I don't work for OpenAI.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, you think about the internet back in the day, memes, small videos that were funny. We didn't know really what would be the true scope and power of the internet, and we went through a dark period where there was unregulated cyberbullying.
Right.
We were all in high school during that time.
Right.
So I think it's astute and it's very intelligent of us as a society to maybe consider all of the potential uses and the potential for misuse as well that can really impact a society, from misinformation. I know I mentioned earlier the profiling via AI that may impact disproportionately other groups like African Americans and Blacks. Emil is a law-abiding citizen. I'm a degenerate. I may commit a crime. They pull over Emil because the AI system said,
no,
that's the guy who did it.
They will not do that. Kristen, where do you fall on this? Because I'm like all doom and gloom when it comes to this AI. To me, this is how the world ends.
So I would
say humans will spectacularly mess this up.
I'm with you. So this is the thing. This is why I straddle the fence, right? I'm naturally I can be a bit of a pessimist. I like to say I'm a realist because it's not pessimism. It's kind of just life. But then I have people like Hiram in my ear who are like, no, you need to learn. This is going to be the future. I have most of my friends are very pro, include the lawyers and non-lawyers are like, this is the way, this is going to be good. This is useful. Even today, some of these questions I used Chat GPT just to humor Hiram, really, because I thought, I never use it. Like, I don't use that thing. I had to Google it to find it, to figure out how to use it.
So
I don't
you're
bother.
gonna be on the world domination side.
No, I'm not.
Total world domination.
I think I lean where you are, where I'm like, I worry about the climate change impact, how much data, how much power, how much water we use for some of these systems. So that concerns me more than how is this going to help us and improve our jobs? It's like, I don't know, humans get smarter. Maybe that's what we need to do instead of using more water to cool a system because we want to make pictures of us if we were in the 1950s, how that would look.
I know you're doing well, Kristen. I mean, even the conversations you're having are elevated. See, I'm just starting to get to that portion. I've been in America for 16 years now. So now I'm like, all right, hey, let's think about the water. But no, you are right. But you are right, though. I'm excited. I really am. But we always goof it up. Like,
What do you think, Hiram?
So I don't think that it's far-fetched to believe that AI could be the end of society, right? I think we're far, far away from that. But, as AI does become more intelligent, I can see the Age of Ultron type of situation for the Marvel fans out there where, AI learns enough about society to say, hey, what's the problem with this Earth? Why is it burning? Oh, it's humans. Well, I know the solution for that. We've seen countless movies, right? iRobot, Age of Ultron.
We'll be gone by then, right?
I think so. But in the immediate application, I do think that it has the ability to free up humans in a lot of ways from some of the day-to-day tasks that are easy. Now, that goes into a completely different political conversation in regards to, well, what happens to certain jobs? And that's going to pivot into my advice for individuals later on in the podcast. But at some point, because AI is here and it's coming and it won't stop, I do think that everyone needs to at least have a general base understanding of AI. And for the attorneys, we really need to get immersed in it.
I know your answer, but just for everyone here, what do you think about people are worried that AI is going to take the jobs of many attorneys? What are your thoughts about that?
I wholeheartedly agree. And that's why I really hope that attorneys do heed to that warning. And, that's where we get the concept of prompt engineering, right? Where we have to make ourselves valuable.
I actually agree. In my time, I've worked with younger attorneys, and I tell them this: if you can't do more than just research, if you can't value add, if you can't read 3-4 cases and tease out the nuances and go to that next level, that you can't find the case site, you're going to get replaced by AI. AI is coming for your job. I really do believe that.
Oh, absolutely. I'll give you an example that how I've used AI in my personal life for fun, nerding out a bit, but it's late night, can't sleep. I'll fire up the Gen AI and work on some things. But I've created fictitious healthcare companies, fintech startups using AI. And with me having kind of a deep knowledge in HIPAA, I can go back and confirm, no, these notices look great, to be sent to consumers. This structure looks perfectly fine. So if AI can kind of do the work of multiple individuals and you have 1 or 2 overseers per project, what happens to, let's take a company that has over 100 attorneys, for example, what happens when we only need 40 of you, so I wholeheartedly agree, Emil.
I think it's levels to it. I think if AI takes the place of some attorneys, yes, for sure, but we won't see it in our lifetime. I struggle to see that. I think we've had many instances of people believing this thing exists. This is a new emerging thing. And because this thing exists, we're going to have less attorneys. And that never happens. Maybe you have 1 less attorney, but en masse, I don't know that I see it.
I think litigators probably have it better in this regard. This is the only time litigations I've seen some of the things it could do with contracts and clause creations and contract drafting and understanding. It is scary. Litigation, and the only reason I think, I mean, and I'm not saying it's impenetrable. It's just because it's built on a system that still involves humans, and humans are crazy. And so AI on some level requires a level of rationality. And so we need to know, you need a lawyer at trial who can look at that like eye roll and go like, hey, and calculate in 5 seconds, that jury based off her background, blah, 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 what I know, and the facts of this case.
But
that
at
means
some point,
my
AI
client's
is
guilty.
gonna know what you know. That's the thing, right? So it's gonna come, if it's gonna come for contracts, which
it has come for contracts.
It has. But what I'm saying is, like, how many companies, they use templates anyway. It's not like people are like, oh, I got to pull out and draft my contract. Like, how often is that happening? And in well-established companies, maybe you're a new company, but even then, you probably talked to outside counsel and they had a draft for you already prepared. This is not some brilliant lawyer. This is the combination of many brilliant lawyers over time who've kind of given you this template. So let's say, okay, fine, AI does that. It's going to be able to come for your job too, if that's the case.
No, the litigation, I think.
I know, you like to think that.
Aspects of litigation, because it is innately just unpredictable. But here's what you just described about transactional, how contracts are drafted, is the exact reason AI will come for it. Because a lot of times you're just taking forms and you're filling in names and you're filling in blanks and all that stuff. And I've never believed in contract drafting as such, right? But I'm just saying in general, people, especially when you're dealing with in a mass contracts office and all that stuff, I always believe in value adding, right? Contract design. I think things like those skill sets become more valuable. And I think lawyers will now need to charge accordingly, because if I have to create a hybrid promissory note with an equity, with a debt characteristic and an equity characteristic and all that stuff, that's going to require a whole lot of different information, right? And I think that type of design is what gets rewarded. And that's where lawyers need to get to.
And now, a word from our sponsors. Would you like to implement new efficiencies into your law practice but don't know where to begin? Practice 411, the State Bar of Wisconsin's Law Office Management Assistance Program, is the place to start. Don't wait. Contact Practice 411 today for a complimentary and confidential consultation at 1-800-957-4670. Thank you. And now back to the Bottom Up podcast.
And that's the prompt engineering aspect of things, where it's like, well, now I can take my deep subject matter expertise and kind of direct the AI to do this.
Yes, and that's my point. Eventually, I think that lawyers, we've said this on this podcast before, can be quite self-important. Like, we think we're the smartest people in the room. Of course, not us sitting here, right? But many lawyers think they're the smartest people in the room. And I am so bright and intelligent that they will never come for my job because it's so important. And I think what AI will expose is, yes, but relax. We can teach something else to do the thing that you do, and it can be just as successful.
Guarantee. The Supreme Court and our judges would not make themselves irrelevant. And so for as long as they make the decisions, they would require even...
I don't disagree. Now, Hiram, I want to talk again about the financial services sector in particular, and I want you to talk way up in the sky, right? Thinking about how AI regulation and privacy regulation is going to change some of the day-to-day in the financial sector. Can you kind of give us some way up here examples, practical examples of, all right, now we have AI, we're going to be able to do this more efficiently. Or now there's this new privacy regulation, we're going to have to switch the way we do ABC differently.
Yeah, I think I gave an example earlier with automated decision-making in employment law. That's certainly one of the areas.
What about surveillance? You didn't talk about that.
Yeah. We can go back to surveillance as well. That's more so just kind of a social issue in its application for AI. I think with policing, lack thereof, however you want to consider that particular topic. So, which question should I address?
I just wanted to, because you talked about it, so we get a sense of what that entails in the AI world.
That concerns me.
I'm thinking of an answer, but I don't want you to give that answer. But I just think this is really fascinating because financial services, depending on who you're talking to, cannot be that sexy of an area. But I think it's obviously unbiased. So I think it's fascinating in the way that we know AI is going to be used in the space. I'm trying to extract from you, like, what are one of those interesting things that you can talk about? It's already happening, right? I think it's already being used.
Yeah, I think depending on the particular sector that you're in, you're going to begin to see specialized regulations tailored to how particular companies may use AI. So, hypothetically speaking, let's consider underwriting, for example. That goes back to the automated decision conversation, right? There are a few a few states, particularly Colorado and New York with their most recent circular letter that begins to address industry-specific uses of AI. So I think that we're going to see a lot of traditional areas kind of turned upside down to a certain extent. And that's going to be interesting to watch as well.
And in terms of the application to underwrite, and is this just to ensure that it's not being used as a way to discriminate against certain groups, or could you explain?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. I think a lot of the emerging regulations and laws speak directly to that bias detection and bias mitigation. So now you've implemented this technology that may be able to tell me whether or not I should give you a policy. Now I have to explain to regulators, well, why is this disproportionately impacting African Americans versus my white counterparts in your pool? So it's interesting.
Let me vibe out just for a little bit.
Yeah.
I think the AI regulations that we come up with to govern this thing that has become intelligent because of what we feed it is a direct commentary on what our society is. You really think about it, right? It's like, so because AI, to a large extent, it being, and without, unguarded, creating racist outcomes or less desirable outcomes isn't because AI is bad. It's because that's the information about us we've fed it.
The underlying data is bad at times, and that's why you need that human element in there, for sure.
So it doesn't become a more messed up natural version of human beings. That's just fascinating.
And that's why we try to train it as much as possible.
So what are some of the more rewarding, or maybe the most rewarding aspect of your work in this area?
I think it's the cutting edge nature of it. I get to learn a little bit every day. I get to work with engineers who speak an entirely different language than me as an attorney, to understand how they're implementing and creating and building out, whether it's through their own means or through open source software. Everything that they're doing is just pretty cool. And just being a part of that is pretty humbling in a lot of ways as well.
So you're talking to young lawyers here. All kind of lawyers listen to this podcast, I think. But let's say young lawyers in particular. What are some resources you would recommend for those who are either interested in getting in this field or just interested in learning more about it?
Yep, the website IAPP, they have a bunch of privacy resources. That's also where you get the certifications that I mentioned earlier, CIPP, CIPT, various other certifications as well. Reaching out to privacy professionals, I'll say it on this podcast, add me on LinkedIn, and we can have a conversation. I can point you to other privacy professionals as well. If you want to speak high level, if you have a familiarity with privacy and you want to get in the weeds a bit, we can do that as well. But I think it's a very open community in that regard. But, above all, I think it's just important to really put yourself out there to learn.
You said earlier on, while we're talking before we started taping, it does have a lot of applications. And so I think of privacy law in general. I don't think of it as its own. I think of one of those practice areas that has, tentacles. What I mean by that is, think about, even in criminal justice and in criminal reform, there is an element of privacy laws and what information the government should have and shouldn't have and what processes it need to go through. In healthcare and the financial sector space, there are just multiple applications. I mean, the Fair Credit Reporting Act on some level is a private form of privacy law.
No, it absolutely is. 1,000%. I'm with you wholeheartedly there. Yeah, FCRA there's a lot happening in that regard on the AI side too. Back to your conversation, Kristen, and underwriting, and because some of that information is pulled pursuant to the FCRA. So now you have to make sure that you're able to follow some of these various privacy laws and communicating back with the AI. I mentioned CPRA earlier, like right to delete. Well, how do we make sure that the AI systems can adequately do that so that you're following various state and federal laws?
Fascinating.
So some closing thoughts to wrap this up. Hiram, this has really been riveting. I've learned so much about privacy and AI here. But is there anything else you want to share with our audience about the importance of privacy in the age of AI?
Yeah, I think that privacy in the age of AI or otherwise is fundamentally a human right. And we as a society should really see it that way as well. Even if the laws don't reflect it, we should become diligent in regards to what we're allowing to be done with our data, how we're allowing systems to train and use our data. Really step back and look at the current benefit versus the long-term detriment that giving up some of your privacy rights could potentially mean for you, and what the consequences are there. So always be as diligent as possible in protecting your privacy rights.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for joining us, Hiram. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. This is riveting.
Please
That's the word.
Join Hiram Bradley.
Word of the day, riveting.
Thank you, Emil. Please add Hiram Bradley on LinkedIn to ask him more about this privacy stuff. He really will nerd out. Trust me.
We can talk about the whole. We didn't get a time to.
You know what's so crazy? Everyone's
It's
still gonna go like, TikTok's in your phone. Chance to look at TikTok videos. Yep.
No, absolutely.
I'll still be in there.
Thank you.
No, thank you. Absolutely.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have a topic you'd like us to explore, let us know. I'm your host, Emil Ovbiagele, and we'll catch you next time.